Don't touch him. The voice cracked through the emergency room like a snapped wire, sharp and immediate. But the black woman didn't flinch, her hand already steady near the patient's chest as the overhead lights burned cold and white against polished tile floors. The steady beep of the heart monitor stuttering just enough to make everyone uneasy. A few nurses turned, their eyes narrowing, their posture stiff with irritation more than concern, because to them she didn't belong there, not in her simple coat, not with that quiet confidence that didn't ask for permission. "Ma'am, you need to step back," Emily Brooks said, her tone clipped, authoritative, the kind of voice that expected obedience without question. But the woman only glanced once at the monitor, once at the patient's shallow breathing, and something in her expression shifted, not panic, not fear, but recognition. Like she had seen this moment before and already knew where it would lead. The room felt smaller suddenly, tighter, filled with the low hum of machines and the distant echo of a gurney rolling past in the hallway. But inside that circle of light, everything slowed, every movement sharper, every second heavier. "He's not getting enough air," she said, calm, almost too calm. And that was what made a few people exchange looks, because confidence without credentials was something they had been trained to reject. Daniel Reed let out a quiet scoff, folding his arms as if the situation was already under control, as if experience alone could hold things steady. "We've got it handled," he replied, not even looking at her directly, just dismissing her presence like background noise. But the woman didn't step back, didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She simply watched, her eyes tracking the rhythm on the screen, the rise and fall that wasn't quite right. A pause stretched, thin and uncomfortable, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. And then the monitor gave a sharper tone, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to signal that something was slipping, something small but critical. The woman inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening just slightly at her side, and for a brief moment the fluorescent light caught the edge of a folder tucked under her arm, official, structured, out of place against her otherwise unassuming appearance. "You're intubating too shallow," she said, quieter now, almost like she was speaking to the moment itself rather than the people around her. And that was when Emily's patience snapped, her heels clicking once against the floor as she stepped forward, drawing a clear line between authority and intrusion. "Security is on the way," Emily said, her voice colder this time, reinforced by the glances of the others who had already made up their minds about who this woman was and who she wasn't. But the woman didn't react to the threat, didn't even shift her stance, her attention still fixed on the patient, as if nothing else in the room held any weight. Outside the glass doors, a shadow moved, someone approaching with purpose, but inside, no one noticed yet, too focused on control, on hierarchy, on maintaining order, while the woman stood, perfectly still in the center of it all, calm in a place that thrived on urgency, waiting for the exact moment when being right would matter more than being allowed. The sound of rubber soles against polished floors echoed faintly as the tension held its shape, thin and fragile, and still she did not move, her gaze anchored to the rise and fall of the patient's chest, as if everything else in the room had already faded into the background. Her name was Aaliyah Carter, though no one there had asked. No one had cared enough to look beyond what they thought they saw. A woman standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, dressed too simply to belong, too calm to be trusted. And yet beneath that stillness was a history none of them could read. Years of training measured in long nights under fluorescent lights just like these. Years spent learning how to listen not just to machines, but to the subtle shifts in breath, the small warnings that came before anything obvious. 5 years earlier, she had walked out of a building not unlike this one, her badge turned in, her future paused, not because she lacked the skill, but because life had demanded something quieter, something harder, and now she stood again in a space that felt both familiar and distant. The smell of antiseptic, the low hum of ventilation, the quiet tension that lived between urgency and routine. Behind her, someone whispered, not softly enough, words laced with assumption, with dismissal, and the kind of casual judgment that had followed her longer than any credential ever had. But Aaliyah did not respond, her shoulders steady, her breathing controlled, because reacting would only confirm what they already believed, and she had learned long ago that the truth did not need volume to exist. Emily shifted her weight again, impatience building in the small tightening of her jaw, her eyes flicking from the patient to Aaliyah as if trying to decide whether to be irritated or concerned, but irritation won. It always did in rooms like this where hierarchy defined everything, and Daniel stepped closer to the bedside, adjusting equipment with practiced hands. Movements efficient but slightly rushed, just enough to miss what mattered. The monitor continued its uneven rhythm, not alarming enough to cause panic, not stable enough to be ignored. And in that narrow space between the two, Aaliyah's focus sharpened, her mind mapping out the sequence, the timing, the correction that needed to happen before the situation slipped further. A nurse near the door glanced toward the hallway where footsteps were approaching, a figure just beyond the glass moving with quiet authority, but inside the room the attention remained, fixed on control, on who was allowed to act and who was not. And Aaliyah felt the weight of that invisible boundary pressing against her. Not new, not unfamiliar, just another version of the same line she had crossed her entire life. Her fingers loosened slightly at her side, then tightened again, not from hesitation but from restraint, because she knew exactly what needed to be done and exactly what it would cost to do it without permission, and still she waited 1 second, then another, listening to the machine, watching the patient, holding steady in a room that was beginning to tilt in ways no one else had yet acknowledged. The air shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of subtle change that only someone truly paying attention would feel, and Aaliyah felt it before she saw it. The patient's breathing turning uneven in a way that did not match the rhythm on the monitor, a disconnect that signaled something deeper was being missed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, tracking the timing, the depth, the delay between each rise and fall. And in that quiet calculation, she already knew the margin they had left was thinner than anyone in the room realized. Daniel adjusted the tubing again. Confident, practiced, but his movements carried a fraction of hesitation now, just enough to betray that something was not aligning the way it should, and Emily noticed it too, her posture tightening, her voice sharper as she issued another instruction that sounded more like control than clarity. "Increase the oxygen flow," she said, her tone leaving no space for disagreement. But the adjustment did not resolve the problem. It only masked it, smoothing the surface while the underlying issue continued to drift. Aaliyah exhaled slowly, her gaze flicking from the patient to the equipment and back again, her mind assembling the pattern piece by piece, not guessing, not assuming, but knowing, and that knowing pressed against her restraint like a weight. The footsteps outside the glass doors grew closer now, steady, deliberate, but still unnoticed by most of the room, their focus locked inward, on procedure, on authority, on maintaining the order they trusted more than instinct. A faint reflection of movement passed across the polished floor, just a shadow at first, then a figure nearing the threshold. But Aaliyah did not look up, not yet, because the moment in front of her was closing, narrowing to a point where waiting would no longer be an option. Another uneven breath, another slight delay, and this time even Daniel paused, his hand hovering for half a second longer than before, uncertainty creeping in where certainty had been, and the monitor responded with a sharper tone. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to pull a few glances, enough to introduce doubt. "Something is off," one of the younger nurses murmured, barely audible, and Emily's jaw tightened again, not in agreement but in resistance, because admitting that would mean admitting they were missing something, and that was not a space she allowed herself to enter. Aaliyah felt the shift fully now, the exact moment when observation had to become action, and her fingers flexed once at her side, the folder under her arm pressing lightly against her ribs as if grounding her, reminding her of everything she carried that no one in this room had bothered to see. The figure outside reached the door, hand pausing on the handle, just as Aaliyah took a single step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but decisive, her voice low and steady as it cut through the layered noise of machines and muted conversation. "You are positioning it too high," she said, each word measured, each syllable placed with precision, and this time the room did not react immediately, because something in her tone was different, not defiant, not pleading, but certain. And certainty, when it arrives without permission, has a way of silencing everything else for just long enough to change what happens next. The words did not echo loudly, but they landed with weight, settling into the space between authority and uncertainty as Daniel's hand froze mid-adjustment, his eyes flicking toward Aaliyah for the first time with something different, not dismissal, not irritation, but a brief flicker of doubt. Emily's reaction came faster, sharper, her voice cutting through the pause before it could fully form. "Step back, now," she said. Each word clipped and controlled, but beneath that control was something tightening, something she could not quite contain as the monitor gave another uneven tone that did not match the expectation of a stable situation. Aaliyah did not raise her voice, did not argue. She simply held her position for a fraction of a second longer, long enough for the reality in front of them to become undeniable, long enough for Daniel's hesitation to stretch into a decision he was not fully ready to make. "Check the placement," she added quietly, not commanding, not pleading, just stating what needed to happen, and this time the words reached him, slipping past pride and protocol into the part of him that recognized when something was not right. His hand moved again, slower now, more deliberate, his focus shifting from routine to reassessment. And as he adjusted the position by a small but critical margin, the change came almost immediately, subtle at first, then clearer, the patient's breathing aligning more naturally, the monitor smoothing into a steadier rhythm that filled the room with a different kind of silence, one that carried recognition rather than tension. A nurse near the foot of the bed exhaled softly, not realizing she had been holding her breath, and another glance toward Aaliyah with a look that was no longer dismissive, but uncertain, questioning, as if trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they had already decided about her. Emily did not move right away, her posture rigid, her expression fixed in a controlled neutrality that masked the shift happening beneath, because what had just occurred did not fit into the order she maintained. It disrupted it, quietly but completely. The door behind them opened without announcement, the sound barely noticeable against the steady hum of the room. But the presence that followed carried weight, a kind of quiet authority that did not need volume to be recognized, and a few heads turned instinctively, their attention pulled away from the bedside just enough to register the figure stepping inside. Polished shoes against tile, measured steps, a pause that signaled observation before interruption, and then stillness. Aaliyah finally stepped back, not because she had been told to, but because the moment no longer required her to move forward, her hands returning to her sides, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, as if what she had done was not extraordinary but simply necessary. Daniel glanced at her again, this time fully, his brow slightly furrowed as if searching for an explanation he could not immediately find, and the room held that tension, that quiet recalibration of understanding, where assumptions began to loosen but had not yet fully broken. Behind them, the figure who had entered remained silent for a second longer, taking in the scene, the positions, the expressions, the subtle imbalance of power that had just been challenged without permission, and then, with a voice calm and precise, spoke words that would shift the room far more than anything that had come before. The voice that followed did not rise above the hum of the room, yet it carried across every surface with a clarity that made people turn before they even realized why. "What exactly is happening here?" it said, measured and calm, and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, as posture straightened and eyes redirected, the invisible hierarchy snapping back into place under a different kind of authority. Emily turned first, her expression resetting into practiced composure, the kind she used when being observed, her tone smoothing as she replied, "Everything is under control." But the words felt thinner now, less certain, as if they no longer held the same weight they had seconds before. The man who had entered did not respond right away, his gaze moving from the patient to the equipment, then to Daniel, and finally settling on Aaliyah with a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to shift the balance of attention in the room. Aaliyah stood still, not defensive, not expectant, simply present, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, as if she had already accepted whatever would come next. Daniel cleared his throat quietly, the sound almost lost beneath the steady rhythm of the monitor, and stepped back half a pace, creating space without fully acknowledging why. His earlier confidence now tempered by the awareness that something in the situation had exceeded his control. "We had a minor adjustment," he said, choosing his words carefully, and the phrase hung in the air, insufficient, incomplete, because everyone in the room knew it had been more than that, even if no one said it aloud. The man's eyes remained on Aaliyah, not questioning, not challenging, but assessing, as if placing her within a context that the others had not considered. And for a brief moment the room held its breath again, waiting for a direction, a judgment. Something to define what had just happened. Emily shifted slightly, the smallest movement of her stance betraying the tension she was working to conceal, because the order she relied on had been disrupted in a way she could not easily correct, and now it was being witnessed by someone whose authority extended beyond her own. "And you are," the man began, his voice still calm, directed not at Emily or Daniel, but at Aaliyah, and the question lingered unfinished, not because he did not know, but because he was giving her the space to answer, to step into a role no one else had offered her. Aaliyah met his gaze steadily, her expression composed, her voice low but clear. "Aaliyah Carter," she said, nothing more, no explanation, no justification, just her name, and somehow that was enough to create a ripple through the room. Subtle but real, as if the simplicity of it carried a weight they could not yet measure. A nurse near the back exchanged a glance with another, confusion mixing with realization, and Daniel's brow furrowed slightly deeper as if trying to recall something just out of reach. The man nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and for a second the room seemed to quiet even further, the steady beep of the monitor now the only constant sound anchoring the moment. Aaliyah did not move, did not shift her stance. She simply stood there in the center of a space that had just begun to see her differently, not fully understood yet, not fully accepted, but no longer invisible. And that change, quiet as it was, carried more weight than anything that had been said. The silence that followed his nod did not feel empty. It felt suspended, as if the entire room had been placed on a thin line between what had just happened and what it meant. And in that space Aaliyah could hear everything more clearly. The steady rhythm of the monitor now smooth and even, the soft hum of the overhead lights, the faint movement of fabric as someone shifted their weight without realizing it. She did not speak, did not step forward again, because the moment no longer belonged to action. It belonged to recognition, and recognition, she had learned, always arrived quietly before it became undeniable. The man who had entered let his gaze move once more across the room, taking in the positions, the subtle tension still lingering in shoulders and expressions, the way some eyes avoided Aaliyah now while others lingered just a second too long, trying to reconcile the version of her they had assumed with the one they had just witnessed. Emily remained still, her posture composed but no longer rigid, her earlier certainty softened into something more careful, her eyes flicking once toward Aaliyah and then away, not out of dismissal this time, but out of something closer to uncertainty, as if she was recalculating her place in a situation that no longer followed the rules she trusted. Daniel adjusted the equipment again, slower now, more deliberate, not because he needed to correct anything further, but because he needed something to anchor himself, something to do with his hands while his mind caught up with what had just shifted. A nurse near the doorway exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost, but it marked the release of a tension that had been building beneath the surface, the kind that does not announce itself until it is gone. Aaliyah felt the weight of the folder under her arm again, a steady presence, a reminder of everything she carried into this room that had gone unseen, and she allowed herself a single breath deeper than the others, not relief, not triumph, just grounding, just presence. The man finally spoke again, his voice even, measured. "You recognize the issue before anyone else," he said, not as a question, not as praise, but as a statement of fact, and the simplicity of it landed differently than any acknowledgement she had received before, because it did not diminish what she had done, it did not frame it as unexpected, it simply placed it where it belonged. Aaliyah met his gaze again, steady, her voice just as calm. "I listened," she replied, and the words were quiet, almost understated, but they carried a depth that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room. into something that could not be easily dismissed. The man held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded again, slightly more defined this time, as if confirming something internally that the others had not yet understood, and around them the room remained still, suspended in that subtle shift where perception begins to change but has not yet fully taken shape. No one laughed now. No one dismissed her presence. No one moved to push her out of the space she occupied, and that absence of reaction spoke louder than anything else, because it marked the moment when she was no longer invisible, no longer background, but not yet fully revealed, and in that narrow space between the two, everything that came next was already beginning to form. The room did not expect what came next, not in tone, not in timing, not in weight, because the man who stood at the threshold of authority did not raise his voice, did not command attention. He simply shifted it with a single sentence delivered as if it had always been true. "You all should already know her," he said, and the words moved through the space like a quiet current, subtle but impossible to ignore. A few brows furrowed, a few heads tilted, confusion rising first before recognition had a chance to catch up, and Emily's posture tightened again, not in control this time, but in anticipation, as if something just out of reach was about to land. The man stepped fully into the light now, his presence no longer at the edge but at the center of the room, and his gaze did not leave Aaliyah as he continued. "Dr. Aaliyah Carter," he said, this time placing the title where it had been missing, where it had been denied without anyone asking. And the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Daniel's hands stilled completely, the small movements he had used to ground himself disappearing as the name settled into his memory, connecting pieces he had not realized were there. And a nurse near the back let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like surprise, like something had just clicked into place. Emily's expression shifted in a way she could not fully control, the practiced composure cracking just enough to reveal the realization underneath, because the name was not unfamiliar. It carried weight, history, reputation, the kind that circulated in conversations just outside rooms like this, the kind that defined standards rather than followed them. Aaliyah did not react outwardly, did not step forward or correct anyone. She simply stood where she had been, the same stillness, the same calm, as if the title did not change who she was, only how others chose to see her. The man allowed the silence to hold for a second longer, long enough for the shift to take root, then added, "She will be leading this department." And this time there was no room for interpretation, no space for doubt. The words landing with a clarity that reorganized the entire structure of the room in an instant. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, but everything else felt different. The air itself carrying a new weight as glances that had once dismissed now recalibrated, now measured, now reconsidered. Daniel stepped back fully, creating space not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more respectful. And the nurse near the doorway straightened slightly, as if aligning herself with a reality that had just been revealed. Emily did not speak, her silence louder than any response she could have given, her eyes fixed on Aaliyah for a fraction longer than before, not with dismissal, not even with irritation, but with the unmistakable awareness that everything she had assumed had been incomplete. Aaliyah finally shifted her gaze across the room, not lingering on any one person, not seeking validation, simply acknowledging the space as it now stood, and in that moment, without raising her voice, without demanding anything, she held more authority than anyone there had been prepared for, because it was not given in that instant. It had always been hers. They had just failed to see it until now. No one moved right away because the meaning of what had just been said did not settle instantly. It spread slowly, like light filling a room that had been dim for too long. And in that quiet shift, Aaliyah remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the title that had just been spoken did not add anything to who she already knew herself to be. The man stepped slightly to the side, no longer the center of attention, because the focus had already transferred. It had landed fully on her now, and the room followed that gravity without instruction. Emily drew in a breath, small but noticeable, her shoulders lowering just enough to signal that something inside her had shifted, something rigid giving way to something more uncertain, And for the first time since the moment began, she spoke without edge. "Dr. Carter," she said, the words careful, measured, as if testing their weight before letting them settle. And in that single change of tone was an entire recalibration of respect. Daniel nodded once, almost instinctively, his earlier posture replaced with one that acknowledged presence rather than dismissed it, his eyes no longer searching for explanation but accepting what had been made clear. Aaliyah finally took a step forward, not to assert, not to claim, but simply to continue what mattered, her attention returning to the patient as naturally as it had first arrived, her voice steady, even. "Let us monitor his breathing for the next few minutes," she said, and the instruction was simple, direct, without excess, yet it carried authority that did not need to be reinforced. The team responded without hesitation this time, movements aligning smoothly, efficiently, not because they had been commanded, but because they recognized the clarity behind her words. A nurse adjusted the readings, another checked the chart, and the room began to move again, not with tension, but with coordination, the earlier friction dissolving into something more focused. Emily remained near the bedside for a moment longer, then stepped back half a pace, creating space without being asked, her gaze lingering briefly on Aaliyah before shifting to the monitor, as if grounding herself in the work rather than the realization still settling in her mind. Aaliyah did not look at her directly, did not call attention to the change. She simply continued, her presence steady, her focus unwavering, allowing the shift to exist without commentary. Because acknowledgement, she knew, did not always need to be spoken to be understood. The man near the door watched quietly, his expression composed, almost satisfied, not in pride, but in confirmation, as if something he already knew had now been revealed to the rest of the room. The steady rhythm of the monitor filled the space again, consistent, reassuring, and with it came a different kind of silence, one that was no longer strained or uncertain, but settled, grounded. Aaliyah's hands moved with quiet precision as she checked the final readings. Then she stepped back slightly, giving the team space to continue, her role already established without the need for repetition. Around her, the glances that once dismissed now carried a different weight, not just respect, but reflection, as if each person was measuring their own reaction against what had just unfolded. And in that quiet evaluation, the room itself seemed to shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that would not easily return to what it had been before. The room no longer felt like it had before, not because anything loud had happened, but because something quiet had settled into place, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and Aaliyah could feel it in the way people moved around her now, more aware, more measured, as if every action carried a new layer of intention. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, a soft, consistent sound that filled the space like a reminder that the moment of urgency had passed, leaving behind only clarity. She stepped away from the bedside slowly, giving the team full control again, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her breathing even, her expression unchanged, because for her, this was never about being seen. It was about doing what needed to be done when it mattered. Behind her, Emily adjusted a chart with careful precision, her movements quieter than before, her earlier confidence replaced by something more thoughtful, more deliberate. And though she did not speak, again, the absence of dismissal in her posture said more than any apology could have. Daniel checked the equipment one last time, his motion steady, but now guided by a different awareness, one that acknowledged that skill did not always arrive in expected forms. A nurse near the doorway glanced once toward Aaliyah, then quickly back to her work, as if still adjusting to the shift that had taken place. The recalibration not yet fully complete, but already irreversible. Aaliyah walked toward the sink at the far side of the room, the soft sound of running water filling the air as she washed her hands, the motion simple, routine, grounding, the reflection of the overhead lights catching briefly on the surface before fading again. She did not rush, did not linger. She moved with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through the entire moment, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. The man who had spoken earlier remained near the door, watching without interruption, his presence now less directive and more observant, as if the outcome had confirmed something he had already believed. When Aaliyah turned back toward the room, Her gaze moved across the team once, not searching for acknowledgement, not holding anyone accountable, simply seeing them as they were now. Part of a system that had just been reminded to look more closely, to listen more carefully. No one spoke, and that silence was not uncomfortable. It was full, complete, like a space that no longer